Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Chelsea. I'm Tim Prestby. I'm here to talk about one of the research studies as part of my dissertation, which is measuring trust in maps, introducing the MAPTRUST Scale. So here's an outline of today's talk. I'll begin by discussing why we should study trust in maps. Then feeding into this are the limitations of existing research on trust in maps. And then this work addresses one of the key limitations that I found and presented on in previous NACIS in Pittsburgh. And then I'll conclude by talking about the significance of this work. Okay, so why should we study trust in maps? So I probably don't need to make a case for you that maps are super powerful. They're these really amazing communication tools. And I still probably don't have to make the case for you that there's also this negative side to them, right? So we see instances here of popular press articles where maps have went viral and caused a lot of pandemonium in the case of Australia wildfires and also in the case of Donald Trump with the famous Sharpiegate map. It's also really important to study trust in maps because the current technological landscape is really different than anything we've ever seen before. There's a lot of muddied sources where people can't clearly identify where something is coming from. Also, AI is changing how we interact with information, with deepfakes really becoming prevalent, including maps. And also the current state of how we consume information is really rapid, and so there's not a lot of critical consumption of information as we continue to scroll and scroll. Okay, so there has been a decent amount of literature on trust in maps and trust in visualizations. I presented on a literature review that I did last year at NACIS, and one of the key findings that I introduced was that there's a lot of inconsistent and untested measures of trust in maps. And so while there has been a lot of this research, a lot of people haven't used established measures of trust in maps. And the most common way that people have measured people's trust in maps, or researchers have measured this, is by asking a single item, in this case, how much do you trust the graph, from not at all to extremely. And while this is really convenient, it's not super valid or reliable. And so trust is a really nebulous concept. It's hard to measure directly. And so we have to measure things that predict trust. And so by introducing just a single measure, that's not a great way to actually empirically study trust in maps. We want something more like on the right here, which is a multi-item scale, which covers different facets. In this case, credibility, which is a related concept to trust. Additionally, there's a lot of inconsistent definitions of trust in maps, and so I found that researchers use different definitions ranging from the believability of information to the reliability of information, or researchers just don't even define what trust is. And so this is problematic as we continue to advance this area of literature, especially in its earliest stages. We need to figure out, okay, what is trust in maps, and make sure that we're talking about the same thing. Okay, so my work in this research seeks to address these limitations of inconsistent measures and also inconsistent definitions of trust. And so it's structured around three research questions. The first is asking, how should we conceptualize trust in maps? In other words, how should we define it? What are the key components of trust in map? The second is, what are the indicators of map trust or trust in maps? So these are, what are the things that we can use to predict trust in maps and indicate whether or not someone actually trusts maps or not? And then finally, after I developed the scale to measure trust in maps, is this scale actually valid and reliable? Okay, so now I'm going to go into each of the individual research questions, the methodologies, and the results for each one of them. So, conceptualizing map trust. I performed what's called a concept explication. This is a methodology borrowed from media studies where you survey a bunch of different definitions of a particular concept. In this case, it was trust and also credibility. And you figure out what are the commonalities here, what are the key components. And so you're basically distilling a concept into its essential elements. And so I came up with this definition here. I'm not going to read it verbatim, but I want to emphasize that there's three major components here. There's believability, willing reliance on the map, and then there's also an expectation that relying on the map will lead to positive things. It won't be detrimental to the map reader. Okay, so research question number 2 was figuring out what are the indicators of map trust. And again, I borrowed a methodology from media studies. So this is scale development. So scale development has 3 major steps, including item generation, exploratory factor analysis, and confirmatory factor analysis. And so this graphic is summarizing these different steps. And so with item generation, you begin with compiling as many potential items that might be a good indicator of your particular concept, in this case, trust. And so you start with as many as possible, and then you begin to winnow it down when you move into exploratory factor analysis. So with exploratory factor analysis, you're figuring out, okay, which one of these indicators or which one of these items are actually performing well, and how do they relate to one another? So you figure out, are there relationships between the items and which ones are performing the best? And then with confirmatory factor analysis, you take the model that you came up with in exploratory factor analysis and you test it on a different set of data and you figure out, okay, does this model actually make sense and does it appear in a different set of data? Okay, so how did I actually do each one of these steps? So begin with item generation. So I surveyed about 20 different articles in information visualization, cartography, and GI science, and human-computer interaction. And I looked at what have existing measures of trust and credibility used. And so I've pinpointed all the different items here you can see in the indicator column. And so there are around 20 different items. So that was one source of the different items. And I also performed a focus group session with some undergraduate students at Penn State, because sometimes, right, the literature might be lacking things when folks in reality think about trust in different terms. And so you can see here on the bottom, there were things like transparency, credibility, whether or not something's reliable. These were all derived from the pretest, whereas the ones more on the top were derived from the literature. Okay, so with exploratory factor analysis, I conducted an experiment where I sampled around 300 people through Cloud Research. Cloud Research is a crowdsourcing platform where basically people sign up to conduct research. They get compensated for their time. And the rationale for using this over a traditional university sample where you survey undergraduates, you know, in like introduction to psychology or introduction to cartography, or the class that my advisor or Harrison teach, 6N, with like 100 freshmen, is that, right, a university sample is heavily biased. You're sampling from university students who are going to be well educated, and that's not the target demographic here, where we want to be more generalizable. And so with Cloud Research, you can survey a more diverse sample and you can also have different quotas for things like education level, income level, race, ethnicity, etc. And so the procedure was set up so that each participant saw 3 different maps. These maps were sampled from news media, social media, as well as academic journals, and so things like the Journal of Maps and Nature. And then for each one of these maps, participants rated how well the set of items, these different items here, described each map. And so here's the results of the exploratory factor analysis. There's a lot of numbers here. I'll walk through them. So the different factors, so there were 3 different factors that arose in the factor analysis, and these factors are groupings of the different items. And so different items, when they correlate strongly with one another, they merge into different factors. And so you can see there's one related to the veracity or the truthfulness, the reliability. Another one is related to appearance. Another one is related to bias. And so after further reviewing these different factors, I found that actually factor 1 is the only important one. The other 2 only explained like 6% or less of the variance of the model, and so we can just remove those from the model and make the model more parsimonious. And so these are the final indicators that exploratory factor analysis indicated were the best ones. And so there are a few here. Three of them were removed because they didn't meet a particular threshold. You can see that the values are lower. They're like around 0.6 or under, whereas the values for the other remaining ones are around 0.8. Okay, so basically we have this model now. So we have a single factor, and there's 12 different indicators of MAPTRUST. And now what we want to do with confirmatory factor analysis is validate this data set. We want to collect more data and make sure that what we found in the exploratory factor analysis is indeed good. So we followed a really similar procedure for this in one of the experiments. So again, surveyed 300 participants through Cloud Research. Again, had them randomly view 3 different maps. And in this case, they rated the maps in terms of the MAPTRUST scale, so these 12 different indicators, as well as 2 related variables, relevance and readability. And I'll get into this later, but collecting these 2 additional variables is good to test whether or not the scale that I'm developing was good and related to other variables. I also conducted a short experiment with 15 participants. You might have actually completed this survey. I recruited participants through the NACIS Slack channel. So there are 15 cartographers, GI science experts who rated the set of 21 potential maps that participants were exposed to. And again, this was to allow for evaluating the scale, which I'll get to in a few slides. Okay, so the main way that we use confirmatory factor analysis is we calculate a set of model fit metrics. And so you can see here there's 4 different ones here. Don't need to worry about what each one of these means. There's a lot of numbers here. But what you can see here is that 3 of them performed really well. So there's this nice green check mark, and then 1 of them performed okay. And this is a really great sign because most of the time, not all the model fit indices are going to perform well, but having 3 of the 4 indicates that we're on the right track and that the model is a good fit, and it's indicating that MAPTRUST can be measured well with this. And so these are the final 12 indicators of MAPTRUST. You can see here that there's things ranging from accuracy to reliability to authenticity. And I see people taking photos. This will be posted, and I'll get back to it in a little bit. So research question number 3 is looking at the reliability and the validity of the measure. And so again, we want to test the fit of the model, but we also want to test it in terms of reliability and validity. And so there's a lot of different components of validity. One of them is content validity. This means how well the particular scale reflects the definition of the concept. And so coming back to this definition here, right, there's these 3 major components of MAPTRUST, including believability, willing reliance, and positive expectations. And if we map these and color code them loosely, there's some overlap here where I think some of them could be color coded to multiple different indicators, but you can see here that each one of these indicators more or less falls into these different 3 major components of MAPTRUST. Okay, so concurrent validity is figuring out, does our proposed measure correlate well with an existing measure? And so in this case, this is where I compared the ratings of the maps of the NACIS Slack channel, the experiment where I recruited the NACIS Slack channel folks. And so there was strong concurrent validity because the most trusted maps by the NACIS folks were also found to be the most trusted maps in the cloud research survey. So this is really good that found that result. And then construct validity is figuring out, okay, is the scale related to these other variables that are sort of like trust, readability, and relevance, but also still distinct from them. So convergent validity found that there's moderate correlation, which is good. We want moderate correlation with these other 2 variables. But then discriminant validity also found out that, okay, yeah, these are distinct enough from these other 2 variables. So the MAPTRUST scale is indeed exclusively measuring MAPTRUST, which is exactly what we want. And then finally, we measured the reliability, and it scored really well. This is a measure Cronbach's alpha, and it's 0.97. The max value is 1, so amazing. We got really good reliability, internal reliability for this particular scale. And so here's the scale. So if you want to implement the scale, you can show participants a particular map, or if you're not a researcher but you still want to gauge someone's map, the trustworthiness of a map, you can just have them fill out this particular survey where you list all the different indicators, and then you ask them to rate how well these words describe a map from not at all to completely. Okay, so the significance of this work. In this work, I proposed a robust definition of MAPTRUST. Again, there was inconsistent or definitions weren't proposed in prior work. I also developed the MAPTRUST scale. So this is a scale that's not only grounded in theory, but it's empirically validated. And I also think it's a really good contribution because I documented the scale development process. Again, this is borrowing from media studies, and I think a lot of cartography and GI science literature could benefit from developing more robust measures for things like visual complexity, et cetera. And so I'm really hitting the highlights here. If you want to learn more, there is a paper that's published open access in the International Journal of GIS. That means any of you here can download it and access it. And so there's a lot more there. If you want to learn more about the nitty-gritty and the methods, I'm also happy to talk about it. But yeah, I'm really happy. I'm finishing my time at Penn State, so I'll be on the job market right now. So if you have any opportunities and want to talk to me, I'm all ears. But thank you so much for your time and making it out here for an early session on Friday.
We have about 5 minutes for questions for Tim.
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. It was so interesting. I was the person taking photos. Cartography, and I've taught 1,000 people how to make maps, but can my students use this to as part of their peer review? Like, can they
Yeah.
measure the trust of as they're doing peer review?
Yeah, I think you could definitely have students fill it out and to do the. It is a tool, yeah. So it's meant for not only researchers but everyday, practitioners who are just making maps to figure it out. So what size of the groups, like the peer review, do they usually?
From a class would be like 10 to 20.
10 to 20.
But they can send it out to whoever they want.
Yeah. So they could definitely do that, and I think that'd be a really cool use of it. And it'd be interesting to see if there are, certain maps that are rated as more trustworthy than other ones, and then you can dig into maybe why that might be.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Have you noticed any patterns in the when you're talking about like getting into why a map might be more trusted or less trusted?
Yeah.
Have you noticed any patterns emerging so far?
Yeah, so the question is, have they noticed any patterns emerging on why some maps might be more trustworthy, other ones less trustworthy? That's the next step, I would say, of the research. I wasn't looking into that particularly. The NACIS presentation that I gave last year, there were definitely some things related to the overall design and aesthetics of the maps, and so people have I'm not sure if you're familiar with the halo effect. So if maps are more pretty or more attractive, people tend to trust them more. And so I think that definitely could be a huge factor. And I would say that now more than ever, source plays a huge role, right? So if someone intersects with someone's political ideology, their prior knowledge, and so for me, if a map is coming from the New York Times versus Fox News, I'm going to probably trust the New York Times map more. Although Fox News, according to the work by Carolyn Fish, doesn't make a lot of maps related to climate change. So, yeah, to answer your question, that's definitely the next stages of the research, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Yeah, in the back.
I think this is related to the second question which I was about to ask. Did you reveal the sources when you were asking about those maps? I mean, did participants know where they were coming from?
Yeah, so the question is, did participants know the source of the map? Let's see here. I think some of them, so some of them it was very clear, other ones it wasn't. And so in this case, you can see one of them is from Visual Capitalists, other one is from Nature, and yeah, it's really interesting actually. So two of the least trustworthy maps were from academic journals. But I would also say, apologies if you've made one of these maps, but they're not the best design, and there's a lot of information, and it's kind of hard to understand them. And so, in a follow-up study that I'll be presenting at AAG, I actually conducted an experiment figuring out which design factors affect people's trust in maps, and I specifically removed source from the experiment because I didn't want that to bias things. However, I think that future experiments should include source and control for it because it is really important, and we need to figure out how that moderates the effects of cartographic design. Yeah, great question.
Time for one more brief question.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was curious if you had only one chance to say something to somebody about increasing the trust of a map, what would it be?
That's a great question. I would say include metadata and transparency about the map, and I think that can foster a lot of trust. I would say that, or make sure that the design looks good. Again, I think that there's so much, especially when we're processing information quickly, right? A lot of our trustworthiness evaluations are based on quick judgments. How does something look? So I would say just making it look professional, I think, is probably the most important thing. Yeah, thank you so much.